The memoir begins in 1977 in Southern California. Carolyn has published her first book of poetry and works as a professor. She's home grading papers when a man she's never met appears at her door. This man, Leonel Gomez Vides, a relative of her close friend, has come to educate her about his country, El Salvador. After a days-long crash course on the history of Central America, he invites her to see firsthand what he says will be another Vietnam from the beginning. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Carolyn Forché and Askold Melnichuk. Carolyn Forché is an American poet, editor, translator, and scholar. Her books of poetry include Blue Hour, The Angel of History, which received the Los Angeles Times Book Award, The Country Between Us, which received the Poetry Society of America's Alice Faye de Castelnuovo Award and was a Lamont Poetry Selection of the Academy of American Poets, and Gathering the Tribes, which was selected for the Yale series of Younger Poets by Stanley Kunitz. What You've Heard Is True is an extraordinary, galvanizing, and timely memoir. The poet Fannie Howe says that now, while we are creating a festering, wounded border in America and a pit of crime and cruelty, this book shows us how such a thing happened. Forché has revived the role of a poet in the modern world. After Carolyn reads, she will be joined in conversation with Askold Melnichuk. Askold is a writer, editor, translator, and professor. He is the author of 4 books and has published essays, reviews, poetry, and translations in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Glimmer Train, the Harvard Review, and elsewhere.
So thank you so much, Shuchi, for this opportunity for an entire community to hear about this astonishing book. Before I begin asking Carolyn questions, before she reads, I wanted to say a couple of things about this memoir. What You Have Heard Is True is a book that defines a generation. It's a born classic in a way that her second book of poems, The Country Between Us, was for a generation of poets. A book is nothing but a burning, smoking piece of conscience and nothing else, said Boris Pasternak. And that certainly applies here. Moreover, it's a page-turner, a true-to-life thriller, a mystery you will not be able to stop reading once you start, and perhaps most importantly, it's not a mystery without solutions. The book arrives right on time, though I understand it took decades to write. You can't miss its relevance to the dramas and tragedies of the present moment. As we gouge deeper at that festering wound Fannie Howe referred to, our border with Mexico, and build more concentration camps for children, this memoir offers us information essential to our understanding of the arriving caravans and their often terrorized pilgrims. It's also a book that extends the work Carolyn began with her first volume of poems, Gathering the Tribes, about which the poet Stanley Kunitz had this to say in his introduction. In the course of her adventures, she dares to confront, as a sentient being, the overwhelming questions by which reason itself is confounded. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? The world she explores may be, like that of Gauguin's celebrated painting with a similar title, semi-tropical, but her Central America is no paradise. In fact, it often seems more like a hell realm in which a handful of demonic men practice their cruelties on the vulnerable. And those questions, which may sound so abstract, are here fully fleshed out. So I'd like to begin by asking you, Carolyn, to read the opening 2 pages, which seem to me a kind of map for what follows.
This is a kind of prologue for the book, and it has a different tone than the story as it begins. It is near the end now. We are walking in the rippling heat of a sorghum field, cicadas whirring to an empty sky. A man uncorks a water gourd. Another man leans against a spade. There is a woman here, too, wearing an aproned skirt over her trousers. Hard light and the dry rattle of sorghum seed heads. I'm holding a spray of seeds. One of the men takes Leonel aside and tells him something, a secret like everything else. We get into the Jeep and without explanation drive to another place not far from this field. The campesinos, rural peasants, would have walked, measuring distance not in kilometers, but in hours or days. What are we looking for? I ask. And as always, he doesn't answer, swearing under his breath through the haze of smoke that hangs in the air where the corn had been growing. We stop near a cluster of champas, shacks made of mud and wattle. One of them has collapsed and smoke rises from it. Wait here, he tells me, but I don't wait. I stopped waiting for him months before this, but he can't seem to break this habit of telling me to wait. Smoke is rolling like a shore cloud along the fields just above the blackened stubble. We walk, and when he stops, I stop. And when he continues, I continue. He palms the air to say, slow down or be quiet. I slow down and am quiet. When we reach the champas, no one is in them. No one is home. A large plastic bowl used for making the slurry that becomes tortilla dough is overturned on the ground. There is a child's t-shirt in the tortilla slurry. Behind one of the champas, it appears that several hens have been held by their feet and whacked against a stone. They are lying on the ground, one of them still opening and closing its beak. 100 or so meters more, and we hear the whine of flies, the hissing and belching of turkey vultures, a flapping of wings like applause in the maize stalks as the fattened birds try to lift themselves. A flatbed truck follows at a distance behind us, with 3 campesinos standing in the back. They are calling out to us or to the driver of the truck, but I don't understand what they say. I don't know what I had expected to see. But not the swollen torso of a man with one arm attached to him, a black pool of tar over his crotch. I didn't expect that his head would be by itself, some distance away, without eyes or lips. The stench in the air is familiar, a rotting, sweet, sickening smell. Human death. I bend down when I see the head, but I hear Lionel saying, "Don't touch it, let others do that." At first I thought we were going to find the rest of the man and place his remains in the truck. But instead, they gather the arms and hands, the legs with their feet attached, and bring them to the torso where it lies on the ground. They set the head on the neck, where it once had been. Then the 3 men take off their straw hats and stand in a circle around the man they have reassembled. They stand, and one crosses himself lightly. The parts are not quite touching. There is soil between them, especially the head and the rest. No eyes, no lips or tongue. Birds hoping we will go away and leave them to this meal. The air hums. We walk. Why doesn't anyone do something? I think I asked. On this day I will learn that the human head weighs about 2.5 kilos. Okay. Now you know how it starts.
But what's so astonishing is that you have no idea where it's going to go. One of the sort of remarkable achievements of this book is the way in which you make us your readers participants in the reassembling of the body, not only the body of those individuals, but the body of the country and the body of history itself. So one of the things as I was thinking about this book over the last week was it struck me, and it was quite, to me, a startling recognition that 1979 is as far from us in 2019 as World War II was to our generation,
Yes.
as the start of the war in 1939 was to 1979.
Yeah. It's true. It's startling, but it's true.
And at the same time, that sort of suggests to me that it might be useful to have some kind of a context that I think a new generation, we were just talking about, might not have for that period. And I was wondering if you could just tell us something about what you were up to 4 decades ago in Southern California before Leonel knocked on your door.
I had spent that previous summer on the island of Mallorca, a beautiful place, and the Baleares chain in Spain, Baleares Islands. I'd gone there with my friend Maya to translate the poetry of Claribel Alegría. I tried to translate it all by myself with a dictionary, and I was naive and young, and I thought all I needed to do a good translation was a very good dictionary, but it wasn't true because I didn't understand the context of the poems. She was writing about El Salvador in that book, a country that had been under military dictatorship for 5 decades, and a country where there had been a severe political repression during the 70s that even resulted in the death of a young, remarkable poet, Roque Dalton. Claribel was living in exile, but she called it a voluntary exile because she had the capacity to live elsewhere in the world. And so I spent the summer with her, and it was the time when the dirty wars in Argentina and Chile, where there was terrible repression and disappearances in the Southern Cone countries. Those people from those countries were also going into exile. They were all fleeing military dictatorships, and Claribel opened her house to them. So every afternoon, I would listen to these people on the terrace having their political discussions. It was difficult for me because my Spanish wasn't that great, but I really tried to follow them and became more and more depressed. And I finished the translations, and I was disturbed because it became clear to me that the U.S. government, that my country was somehow backing and supporting these regimes and therefore was responsible for them. So I asked the writer Mario Benedetti, when he was visiting, I said, what should I do? I would like to do something, to help, to work, to do something. And he said, my dear, the thing you could do that would most help us is you should change your government. And then he looked at me and he said, enjoy your summer. So I came home thinking I have to change my government. I had already marched against the Vietnam War, and I don't know if any of you who marched against the Vietnam War noticed, but after the Vietnam War, everybody sort of disappeared. And there were no more marches, and there were no more gatherings, and people went about their lives, and everyone I knew went to law school. And I was a poet, and I luckily got a teaching job in San Diego, and I was teaching 4 sections of freshman composition, big classes. And so I was always grading papers. And that's the context. I'm alone at home grading papers, and Leonel Gomez rings my doorbell. Mm. And they had talked about him all summer on occasion and presented him as a very mysterious guy. They didn't understand him. He was their cousin, but they said he's sort of like a Robin Hood. He sleeps on the ground with his motorcycle in his arms. He gave his land away to the campesinos, but he might work for the CIA. Or maybe he's a guerrilla commander. But he's a champion marksman, and he's a champion motorcycle racer, and he collects tiny metal model ships. So I didn't, that's it.
And he arrives at your door with his 2 daughters in tow.
2 little girls. That's partly why I opened the door, because he had these 2 little girls with him.
I kept wondering about that.
And, also, he did look like the man in the photograph in Claribel's study. So, and so when I opened the door with the chain on, and he said, "You are Caroline Forché, and I am Leonel Gomez Vides. And these are my daughters." So my creative writing students had given me 3 rabbits for Easter, and there were 23 rabbits in the backyard. So we sent the girls to play with the rabbits, and Leonel came in and spent 3 days talking about Central America, beginning with the history of the conquistadores and all the way to the present. And he had covered my table with white paper, and he he drew cartoons and drawings of everything as he talked. I learned why later, why he made these drawings. But at the time it was fascinating because I'd never seen anybody who illustrated their own speech as he went along. And by the end of that visit, he had asked me, he wanted a poet to come to El Salvador. And I said, well, I think maybe you want a journalist. And he said, no, I want a poet. I don't want a journalist. So he explained that he thought poets were open to the world in ways that journalists might not be, and that journalists were striving for objectivity, and he wanted, and so he said, besides, then you'll be in a position when the war begins to talk to the American people. So I tried to explain to him how poets are viewed in the United States and how much access poets have to the general population of the United States to speak to serious matters of foreign policy. And I said, well, we're just not taken seriously. And I went into some biographies of what happens to poets in America. And he said, well, you'll have to change that. And he said, because we take our poets seriously. We put them in prison or we send them abroad as diplomats, but we take them seriously. So that's how it was.
But you also seemed startled in that initial encounter when he asked about your grandmother by name, your grandmother Anna. How was that relevant?
Well, he was kind of cagey and mysterious, and if you asked him a question, he would answer indirectly or not at all. And and so every once in a while, he'd say something in the conversation that I didn't know how he knew, and it was weird. It turned out that he had read my first poetry book, so he knew my grandmother was named Anna, things like that. But other things, such as the fact that I'd been awarded a Guggenheim.
That was a really interesting moment.
I didn't know how he knew that because I hadn't really told very many people yet. And nobody that he knew about it. So he never really told me how he knew that.
Well, but since you mentioned that, he also said something very interesting about the Guggenheim. He said, do you know the history of where that Guggenheim money comes from? And that's especially sort of on point at this moment as we have the Sacklers and Pharma kind of being called out for what they've done.
That's right.
And so I wonder what your own sort of, this sort of takes us out of the book for one moment, but how do you feel about the way in which we kind of quietly accept those awards without looking at the history of what it is we wind up endorsing along the way? Because that was sort of his point, I thought.
Yes, I think it was his point. He talked about Anaconda Copper and, the whole history of how the money was made. And ironically, my grandfather had worked in a coke oven in a smelter. And, so as he was describing the labor conditions in Latin America, I remembered my grandmother's stories about the smelter and the coke ovens. It was very familiar. And Lionel even commented at one point, well, maybe the Guggenheim is your grandfather's just wages, so it's okay, you can take it. But, what he was always concerned about, and which we have to be concerned about, which we have not been, is corruption.
Right, sure.
Right.
Sure, that becomes a major sort of motif here. One of the books that kind of surprisingly came to mind as I was reading this has a line in it I'm sure you'll recognize, I'm learning to see. That's from Rilke's Notebooks of Malt Brygge.
Yes.
And Rilke seems an unlikely kind of spirit to be hovering around this particular book, since he is in some ways the most apolitical of 20th century poets. And yet I do feel that his presence and that sort of the wisdom of the deep wisdom of that line and the implications of it beyond the obvious are very much a part of the story you're telling here.
I read Rilke avidly for many years. I admire his poetry. The subject of this book is learning to see. It's not war. It's not really the history of Salvador. It's learning to see, but being shown how to see by a guide. Being led through a journey. It's a story of a journey, of an education in seeing the world, and that unfolds. I decided to not to break the spell of the narration. It starts a regular narrative after that passage that I read to you. The doorbell rings and I answer the door and we have those scenes. But I decided that I wanted a reader to come with me, and so the reader never knows any more than I knew at the time. So I'm trying to work out what's happening, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on around me, and I don't help the reader to know any more than I do. So I never step into the present in the book. And I know that's not typical of memoir. We are supposed to reflect in the present on our experiences, but I thought it was better to do this as a crawl through a tunnel. And so I'm not really the main character, I'm the narrator. And so I don't know whether it's a memoir in that sense.
But it's an amazingly effective and wise decision on your part. I thought it was, in a way, there is Virgil, and he's taking you through the Inferno. I'm afraid we don't get to the Paradiso quite here, but Leonel had remarkable access to so many strata of society, and that also is sort of just historically, thrilling. It's fascinating to walk into so many different rooms. He knew the high and low, rich and poor, pacifists and military, paramilitary and insurgents, and you find yourself entering into some pretty wild spaces.
He wanted me to know everything, so he was from he had a small coffee farm. In El Salvador, traditionally they called it the Catorce. They were the 14, the oligarchs, the families that owned everything. There were more than 14 of them. But some of them no longer had wealth, and some of them did. He was one who didn't. But he knew everyone, and he had a social position. And it was a class position. But he also, at a very early age, he was 4 or 5 years old, when he developed a consciousness of how the people who worked these farms were being treated. And his life, there's an episode where he talks about what he did when he was young, and that opened him.
Do you want to read that? Or?
I don't know exactly.
Okay.
I can just say that he went and he was 5 years old, and he went and got a shotgun from his father's house and threatened a foreman who was beating a campesino. And the foreman stopped beating the campesino. And what Leonel took from that was, oh, so you can stop this. Right. There are things you can do. I mean, I'm not recommending aiming shotguns, but it was that there's nothing we can do. So he devoted his life to working to alleviate the poverty and improve the conditions for farm workers, but he still knew all of those people, and because he was a champion marksman, he helped the military. I mean, he trained people to shoot just because he was an expert at it. So he knew the officers. This came in handy later. He cultivated everybody and talked to everybody and told me I would talk to the devil if it would help. And I have to say, I never worked out. I can't answer the question, who was he? I never resolved who was he in terms of, I know that he advised a guerrilla commander in the FMLN. I know little things about him. I can't rule out that he ever worked for an intelligence. I don't know. What I did resolve is who he was as a human being and in his soul. I'm very comfortable with that person. But the rest, some of the mystery does not get cleared up.
One of the things that he talked about, and sort of almost the kind of game that he had you play with him as he led you into these various spaces, was what he called creating the symphony of illusion.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that very resonant phrase?
Well, he had a couple of phrases he used. One was the symphony of illusion, which is, it's not... When you're dealing with a military such as El Salvador had at the time, with its structure, and and they're puzzled by the United States, and they didn't understand why President Carter had instituted a human rights policy, and they're trying to figure out the Americans. And so what Lionel did was to try to, he said, it doesn't matter what reality is. We are going to tell them what reality is. So we are going to create this world and present it to the military as the world. And he did that in order to dissuade them from being even more murderous than they were. You'll have to read the book to find out about this. But the Symphony of Illusion was, he actually believed that most people were, had to varying degrees, were living with illusions about the larger world and how it worked. The way that we live under the illusion that we don't have the kind of corruption that we actually have. Or we live under the illusion that we are, the good guys in the world. Those kinds of illusions. So he was interested in that. And he also said, Carolyn, there are always 5 versions of the truth. And you have to make sure that your version is the one that, is believed when you're dealing with military dictators. So he had a lot of strategies, and he was playing a very complicated game, and he was playing it alone.
I mean, he was also trying to, it seems, to protect you in case you were being followed, because it seems like he wanted to be sure that if you were seen going to talk to the campesinos, you were also seen going to talk to the colonels, so that nobody quite knew who you knew and who you worked for.
He wanted to cultivate, the cultivation of mystery was in the service of staying alive, for himself and for me. And in the beginning, I just thought he was, was irritating. Why do you have to be so mysterious? And as I learned what the situation I was in, death squads were operating in the capital and in the countryside, military death squads, civilian death squads. The military death squads had the backing of the United States, and they were disappearing and killing about 1,000 people a month in the capital when I was there. So the fear was pervasive. It was very intense, and everyone lived with it. We were talking about a fairly small middle class and a very large class of impoverished people. And these death squads were preying not so much yet on the poor, they were preying on people who might be in a position to oppose the government with some real influence or power. So they preyed upon labor leaders and professors and teachers and doctors and priests and nuns, because the church had become very committed to part of the church to the poor. And so those were the people that the death squads were rounding up, especially in the city.
Well, so he keeps asking you to ask the various sort of military and political characters you meet about one particular person who becomes a kind of bait throughout this. Richards, a guy named, James Richardson?
Oh, Richardson, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what was that story? Because that really is a very sort of
it's sort of
real lure here.
Yeah, he was a North American, African American, U.S. citizen, and he was killed in the custody of the Salvadoran government in 1976, and Lionel knew that if the Salvadoran government would get away with killing a North American citizen, and nothing much would be done about it, they would move on from there to more extensive killing. And there was one particularly murderous colonel named Chacon, and Chacon is the person that we believe ordered the killing of Ronald Richardson. So Lionel was determined to solve this murder and to make it important. The ambassador and the political officer in the U.S. Embassy at the time tried to get Washington interested in this, and they got nowhere. And then their resignations were picked up, and the new staff at the embassy had no interest in this death.
And that new staff was appointed by Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
That's very disturbing.
Yes. It's disturbing because, but so we're trying to make it appear to the Salvadoran military that the U.S. does in fact care about this African American man. And that was part of the Symphony of Illusion and the cultivation and the 5 versions of the truth. It didn't matter, but we wanted to make it seem that it did. And that is one of the threads of this story. And Chacon is also a thread of this story. I can read
Yeah.
a little piece to you that'll give you an idea of a little bit of Lionel's personality. But he had taken me to meet General Medrano, who was a retired. He was like no one writes to the colonel. You know, he was an old colonel, and
Happy
I
uncle.
just come from there, and now we're in a car. No, we're not. We're at the. I'm going to start with the coffee farm. The highlands were fog-wrapped from a distance, and as it was January, the coffee harvest was still in progress, although coming to an end. Harvesters were among the coffee trees, pulling the last of the coffee cherries into the canastas tied to their waists. When these canastas were filled, these cherries were poured into a sack that the harvester dragged behind her, and when the sack was full, the coffee would be weighed and the harvester paid. So many centavos for each terrea of coffee. Almost nothing, Lionel explained, downshifting around a curve, filling the silence that still hung between us. It has always been almost nothing. Nothing and a tortilla, maybe. And you know, it wouldn't have gone as well if you had known any more than you did, referring to our visit with Medrano. And then he asked if I knew when coffee consumption had begun, and for a moment I saw the Lionel who had visited me in California. Without waiting for an answer, he shouted over the engine, "In the 15th century, in the Sufi shrines of Yemen." No, I didn't know that. Well, then there might be other things you don't know. Such as when those sons of bitches interrogate someone, they tie the man to a chair, put his hand on the table, cut off one of his fingers, and they flush it down the toilet before asking the first question. He glanced at me, barely taking his eyes from the road. I tried not to react. And our Colonel Chacon has a friend he works with, and this friend claims to be a doctor, but I don't know. The doctor injects the spine of the victim with anesthetic. Then he slices through the person's abdomen with a scalpel, reaches in and starts pulling out guts while the person is conscious and can see what is happening. And then the colonel gets to his first question. "All right," I said, "all right." Pushing a cassette into the player, he asked if I minded music. Okay.
Yeah. So, one of the other very important figures in your journey is a woman named Margarita. And I was wondering if you might read the top paragraph on page 140 to kind of give us a sense of what she...
She's very important to this story.
And you may want to set it up, I don't know.
Top paragraph on 140, okay. Margarita is still my friend. She's alive. She survived all of this. And she secretly was one of the broadcasters for Monsignor Romero's radio station. But the death squads thought her voice was that of a nun. She was not a nun. She was the mother of 3 children. And that protected her. So she wasn't apprehended. So this is, Margarita had insisted, this part that Margarita had insisted that I be my own person. Lionel was also adamant that I think for myself, that I let go of my preconceptions, although I hadn't until then been aware of having any. But all right, I thought. How to do that? Lionel had complained of my daydreaming, that I wasn't paying proper attention to things around me in my waking life, so from now on I would pay attention and try to see as much as I could, not the world as I imagined in my continuous waking dream, but as it was. Not only the obvious, but the hidden. Not only the water cántaros, but their weight. Not only their weight, but why it was necessary to carry water such distances. I would try to learn from Lionel how to listen to what was said, but also what was not said, and I would also try to learn how to detect deception in others, which he assured me is a skill that can be acquired. I would learn to review my experiences for the missed details, and to keep in mind that while I was observing others, they were also observing me, and I would become less, how did he put it, readable. and when necessary, I would attempt, in his words, to manage the perceptions of others, so that of the 5 versions of the truth in any given situation, mine might prevail. This place is a symphony of illusion, Lionel often said, and an orchestra needs a conductor.
So you write, the girl I once was who had been a Catholic.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the role that religion played in the life you were born into. You write that for a while you thought of becoming a nun, and then how your sort of religious training and education prepared you for what Lionel asked of you. And perhaps from there you might also say something about a part of history that, again, a new generation may not be too familiar with, and that is liberation theology.
Yes, I was born, I'm a cradle Catholic. I went 12 years to Catholic school. I was taught by the Dominicans, so I'm a survivor of 12 years of Catholic school. And many of us who were raised Catholic in very strict families that followed the liturgical year drifted away, especially after Vatican II. And, we went to college and we read other things, and, we drifted away. And when I got to Salvador, it'd been a long time since I had practiced Catholicism, but El Salvador was alive with this church that was so committed to the poor, and it was a live, active, vibrant church, and Monsignor Romero was the head of this church there. And the people that Lionel knew, he was very close friends with the nuns at Divine Providence Hospital where Monsignor Romero lived. And so I got to know them. And he was very close with certain priests in the countryside, and I got to know them. And they were working on all sorts of social projects, and the nuns were running a hospital for poor, terminally ill people. It was very much engaged in real life. But they had something called the preferential option for the poor, which is that if you're going to do this work, you have to accept the fate of the poor. So that this is why no one ran away from, the poor were endangered in that military dictatorship. And if they were going to be endangered, everybody had to be endangered. And so that is what that means. And I was fascinated because this was not the church I was raised in. And I was drawn to it. And the people that I was with, who were religious and lay people in this church, were brave, really brave. They had a kind of courage I hadn't encountered before, and they were willing to give their lives for each other, actually. And I hadn't been around that either. And when I realized that they would do that for me, that was startling. And so I try to tell that story too. And Monsignor Romero is very important here to this story.
You were present at his last interview.
Yes. I made the last recording the week before the week before he died. It was a time of great nervousness. Monsignor Romero sensed that something was going to happen to him, and he became a little bit depressed. I don't know how many people, I don't know how much this is really publicly known, but the morning that he was assassinated, he was depressed, and they took him for a walk on the beach because he liked to walk on the beach. And whenever he got afraid, he said his knees would start to shake. So they were shaking. And finally, Madre Luz, who was the mother of the convent, she said she was a very close friend of his, and he died in her arms behind the altar. Madre Luz said to him, "Don't worry, Monsignor. You're not going to die before your time. When God takes you, that is your time. Don't worry. Nothing is going to happen before that." And he said, "Yes, right. Okay." So, but he was very calm the week before, and a Venezuelan journalist had a little, one of those reporter's notebooks, and he was going to interview Monsignor, and Monsignor said, "Come sit down," and I had my tape recorder. So I turned on the button, and he made his notes, and he asked all the questions. Monsignor was very calm and the Venezuelan journalists wanted to get Monsignor to talk about the guerrillas, and and he was very distant about that. He said, I'm a shepherd. I'm here to take care of all of my people, and people have a right to protect themselves against this murderous regime, and soldiers shouldn't obey unjust laws, all of the things that that he said. And then we went to a supper in the convent kitchen, not the Venezuelan journalists, but Lionel and Madre Luz and Monsignor and the other nuns and me, and that was the night. That was the supper where I was informed I had to leave the next day, El Salvador, and I didn't want to go. So I wasted my last moments with him, trying to persuade him that I could stay a little longer, and also trying to persuade him to leave because I was afraid he was going to be killed. And he said, "No, my place is with my people, and now your place is with your people. You have to go to the United States and you have to talk." And I said, I won't be able to talk. I'm a poet. And he said, "You will. You just have to prepare." So I left the country the next morning, and he was assassinated a week later. And
now he's a saint.
And now he's a saint. In October, he was made a saint, yes.
And I have 1,000 more questions for you, but it seems it's time now to turn it to the floor and see what questions you may have for Carolyn, and then I'm hoping we'll have a chance to let Lionel have the last word. So, questions from the audience?
Anything. And maybe they're intimidated by television.
I'm just curious, though, about Lionel, and, not familiar with the whole thing, but as you're speaking, I'm wondering if there was times where you thought he was presenting you with an illusion that may have not been real, and did that ever make you feel like you were being part of his grand scheme, or?
Oh, I knew I was part of his grand scheme.
But you know what I'm saying? If he was presenting you with stuff that wasn't actually real in order to achieve a goal of some other kind? Or?
He didn't usually tell me things. He'd put me in a situation and let me have an experience for myself.
Okay.
He wanted me to think for myself, and he didn't want... he resisted contextualizing things ideologically. And so that wasn't the problem. The problem was I was inundated with experiences in a situation that I had to sort out. But it was a situation that was creating great fear among everyone who was in it. And profound courage these people had. I want to say that it was really moving and impressive how the Salvadorans were in those moments, and the risks they took for each other, and what they were willing to sacrifice for each other. But it was a tough time, It was some things were very apparent. The poor were deeply impoverished, and they were oppressed by the regime, and it was a kind of feudal state that they were in. Those things were obvious. The bodies scattered around that had been killed were obvious. These things can't be denied. So that's not what I mean by sorting out. I think what I meant by it was trying to determine what action I should take, and what I should do, and how how we could keep everyone alive.
I just wonder if you could talk about that sense of responsibility that you would have felt after leaving El Salvador, and the sort of, that you were anointed or chosen to be the storyteller, and if that felt like a burden that got in the way of your writing at all, because you felt this sort of expectation, maybe.
Well, I didn't set out to write about El Salvador in poetry, but I got 7 poems about El Salvador. They came, and so I let them come, and I wrote them. And because I had those poems, and they were published in a book that was very controversial, because it was considered political.
Yeah, it's an
and
interesting story too.
It was really tough, because the poetry world did not like this kind of thing to be in poems, but it allowed me to go off into the United States and talk. So I'm in synagogues and churches and Rotary clubs and all kinds of places. I went to 49 states I didn't get to go to Hawaii, of all states to miss. But, you know, it was, and the work really helped. You see, when you're depressed or when you're traumatized, one of the things that really heals you is to just engage, you know, and go and do something and go and work. And it really does help you, you know. If you want to cure depression, you know, volunteer somewhere and help other people. When you help other people, you help yourself. So I was driven. I was very obsessed, and I kept talking and talking and talking and talking. And Lionel had only asked me, the only thing he ever asked me was, please someday tell this story. Please someday write about this. And I wasn't capable of it for 20 years, writing it. I needed to process it. I needed to mature. I needed to get some distance on everything. And other things had to happen that were included in this book. And then it was a struggle to do it, you know, because I'm not a prose writer. I never
Could have fooled
structured.
me.
I never structured a book, you know. I had to find a form for it and a voice, and because there are periods that are very intense in here, that I began to use some pieces from notebooks that I actually wrote at the time. And they're always in pencil because I like writing in pencil. It's so tentative, and you can erase it really easily and get rid of it. And it's not as much of a commitment as ink is. So I used some, and then I thought, oh, this is the form that those moments should take. So I invented a language for the moments when the mind is overwhelmed with what's going on. So it's not all this narrative, you know. It changes as the book goes on.
Did Lionel live to see that book?
He read half of it.
Did he respond to it?
He loved it. He said, how did you remember all of this? He was happy. And he wrote a letter, and he gave it to me, and I opened it, and it said, Caroline Forget has my permission to write anything she damn well wants to about me. And he said, give this to your publisher, you know, because he knew that, you know, you have to, you're
Liable.
I'll tell you what happened. I give you one little passage, small, but it's what happened to Lionel. What happened to Lionel in the end was he survived. He hid in a pile of garbage from 40 soldiers who were sent to apprehend him. No one gave him away. He made his way to the United States. He went into exile. He was given asylum. In those days, you weren't detained. You just filled out papers in the airport and went on your way and went through the process of asylum, which took a couple of years. And if it failed, you went through the process of appeals and so on. So he was here for a long time. And he then went knocking on doors in the Congress. And he was able to get a lot of things done in the Congress. And ultimately, he arranged the first meeting that ended the war. You know, so because he could bring the Americans and he could bring the guerrillas and he could bring the army, and he brought them all under a jacaranda tree and they had the first meeting. It was amazing. So he died of 5 heart attacks in one night in a hospital in San Salvador on Thanksgiving Eve, 2009. So this is just a little bit. We went to the Huazapa volcano where a good deal of the war was fought to scatter his ashes. So I'll just give one paragraph of this so you know something about Huazapa. From the peak of the volcano, city and sea are visible, and the whole of the country as it shrinks to its place on the maps, small and poor beneath us, a country that had for a time grown large under the gaze of the world. Before the war, tapirs lived in the mountains' folds, monkeys and iguanas, coyotes and even jaguars, the wildcat of his prescient dreams. Hundreds of species of birds alighted here, 1,000 of butterflies, and the streams ran clear through Huazapa's ridges to the river. No longer. Thousands of pounds of bombs rained into this forest during the war. White phosphorus and napalm also rained. So that might have been the reason he had brought me here just before the war began. and why he was silent all afternoon more than 35 years ago. He had said that he wanted to show me a beautiful place, to take a rest from the work we were doing, to climb, to see as far as we could. But I now know that we were here for a different reason. Here, so that he could steady the far hills in his field glasses and read the terrain of a future free fire zone. Here to commit the mountain to paper, and then to say goodbye. I still have the paper on which he drew the mountain. Okay.
Just wondering what you think about the condition of the country today, caring about what you care about. It's polarized. There's identity politics. On one side, the Republicans care about wealth. On the other side, there doesn't seem to be this interest in the middle class or the working class in this country. Why would Americans care about the poor in other countries?
I'm not saying they do, but I think what's the problem with the middle class and the working class in this country, and I think there's a new movement that will alleviate that somewhat, was the destruction of the labor movement and the unions. And what working people need are unions. They need to be represented. They need to be organized. There need to be forces in civil society that counter certain other forces. You know, you can't put all the power into corporate moneyed hands, you know, and you can't buy the political system and destroy democracy and just, you know, and expect that there's going to be anything but a disaster, which is the period we're living through now. But I tell you that I feel very hopeful, not because of this regime, but because of the Americans that I've talked to all over the country who they're awake. Whole communities are emerging. They're forming alliances. You know, the resistance to this has been, I think, heartening. And you know, you have to imagine. Lino once said to me, you know, he said, "Do you know that you have more resources in a single Kinko's copy shop than we had in the whole country of Salvador when we started our opposition to the government?" He said, "You don't realize what you have. You have all the resources." And the thing he had to convince me most of was that one person could do something. Not that, oh, I'm powerless, I can't do anything, I'm just one person. It's the opposite is true. And this is the biggest illusion that I think we have in our formation in the United States, that there's nothing we can do and that we're just one person. One person is a library. One person is history. One person is powerful. When he wanted me to talk to the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, I said, I can't call the embassy. I'm just nothing. I'm not anyone. I'm not important. And he said, you are a U.S. citizen. Pick up the phone. He has to talk to you, and he's going to want to talk to you because you've been talking to everybody. So that's what I mean. I didn't have confidence, and I thought, I'm no one, I can't talk.
Okay, go ahead.
Back.
First, thank you so much for what you said about unions. As someone who works in organizing, I'm very grateful for that comment. Second, I was wondering how, I lived in Nicaragua for a few years. I was wondering how you engaged with living in a place that was so affected by kind of like U.S. foreign policy, when you kind of like went about your daily life and people saw that. I know it, like I lived in Nicaragua recently and people still thought, you know, there's you as an individual and then there's the place you come from that has affected my family and my life. So I guess how did you engage with that conflict?
It might be different now. There weren't very many Americans in Salvador at all when I was there. The press hadn't arrived yet much, you know, not until the very end of my stay, because the press only goes to one place at a time. And they were in Iran and Nicaragua. They were not in any other country. So we have that situation. So I didn't know. I only knew the American Peace Corps volunteer. And then there were the people who worked in the embassy, but they never left the embassy. So they were very sequestered. No one ever saw them anywhere. You had to go to the embassy to see them. So I was kind of a rare person to be an American. And I can't say I know how they felt about me, but they certainly protected me, and they certainly were kind, and they never treated me like I wasn't among them as one of them. But maybe they did think of me as a U.S., enemy, but that's not how it felt. Not ever. Oh, what? Wait. In the beginning of Margarita's relationship with me, she didn't like North Americans. And so she wasn't very nice to me in the beginning. And then we became best friends. But in the beginning, she was like, well, you are a Yankee, So, yeah, that's right. I have to correct myself on that.
At that moment in time, if Robinson had been white, would the U.S. have cared any more about what happened?
They always care more about white people, but I think in this case, they did not want to stir the pot. They did not want to investigate this death because of who ordered it. Chacon was a murderous butcher, and he had his own private army within the army. He also was trying to, in a mafioso way, take over Central America, using people from the failed Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba and so on. So there were all of these, killers that were looking for mercenary work, and Chacon had that going on, So for some reason, the United States didn't want to touch that, and they certainly didn't want to go after the Salvadoran government in that moment when the revolution was about to begin. So I'm not sure they would have gone very, very much of a distance for anybody that Chacon murdered at that time. But it's always the case that white people are investigated and black people are not, yeah. So I don't know how much race was a factor in that, but I suspect it was also political.
When the experience of terror is so close at hand, the question I have is, what did you find fed the spirit of resistance in the face of that? Because it's so terrifying to have death so immediately in your face.
Are you asking about among the people in El Salvador? Okay. They had exhausted all peaceful means of struggling against the government. They had their peace marches and the strikes, and every single action was attacked, fired upon, people died. And it got to be that they had one choice. They could be killed, or they could go to the mountains and organize and take up arms against the government. And so the people who joined the guerrillas were in the latter group. And there were many in the former group who were killed. So these were people who decided they were going to defend themselves and they were going to defend each other. The Christian-based communities that were developed were very important to this because they became aware that they were brothers and sisters, and that they were brothers and sisters making a new world, a new society, And so they bonded, and there was a kind of, I don't know how to explain it. It was a spirit among them, a spirit in the air, a selflessness among them. So they weren't afraid even some of the time, on a spiritual level, they weren't afraid, emotionally always afraid, but this grew among them. One person stands against butchery, and someone else stands up too, and then a third one in the back, and a fourth one in the other row, and pretty soon everyone is standing. That's more or less how it works.
You have a wonderful passage exactly about that right here from Lionel.
Here's Lionel talking. It isn't the risk of death and fear of danger that prevent people from rising up, Lionel once said. It is numbness, acquiescence, and the defeat of the mind. Resistance to oppression begins when people realize deeply within themselves that something better is possible. He says a lot of things like that in this book. He's very smart, and I remembered, some of them I wrote down, some of them I just remembered. He was very amused by his young self being quoted, but he was happy to, and I'm glad that I finally finished this because I kept my promise to him, you know, write about it someday. Interestingly, he said, I'm not going to tell you what to write, but I want you to write about it. And he kept saying that he said, I'm trying to help you to see, but I'm also learning, you know, as we're going along. He even said to me at one point, he said, I don't have the answers to your questions. I'm just a man. So it was pretty.
He seemed to be teaching everyone, including the his own tenant farmers. There's a remarkable scene in which you are kind of grilling him because he is lowering the rents on that his tenants are paying who are living on his land, on his finca, and you're asking him why he doesn't just give it away.
Oh, okay. Well, he had this farm, and you know, it was in a remote area. It was very difficult, and they were farming as tenant farmers. And one day he said, if you form a cooperative, I will charge you half rent. And so some of them did, and some of them didn't. And I tell the story of what happened. Eventually, they were all in a cooperative, but by the time I saw the place, he was still kind of collecting rents from this cooperative and coming to see them every year and see how they were doing. And Padron, I said to him, you are a, what is the word for this person who, the boss, you know, he was paternalistic with them, I said, you know. And I said, why don't you just give them this land? And he said, I can't give it to them. They have to take it from me.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that he showed your poem, The Colonel, to the Colonel.
Yes, he did.
I read, and instead of feeling anger or something, he was actually complimented by it.
Yeah. The Colonel poem that I wrote in my book, this was an old poem many years ago, but Lionel was visiting my house once in the era where he's working in Washington, and he said, oh, by the way, I showed the Colonel your poem. And I said, you did? Why? You know, and he said, no, he liked it. He liked being in a poem. He laminated it. I couldn't, you know? So I said, okay. I wouldn't have done that if I were him, but the Colonel liked his poem. I don't understand how he could like it, but he did.
Wasn't he a poet also?
No,
was in one of the other ones?
That was one of the other ones, yeah. Every time I told someone in Salvador that I was a poet, especially in the military, they would say, yes, and I am also a poet. I write poetry too. So I thought, okay, that's not a very good identity, you know. So
Thank you so very much. I mean, amazing.